Hi everybody and welcome to the English Lab's Texts in 10. My name is Ben Taylor and over the next 10 or so minutes I'm going to take you through three really key ideas that we feel are going to help you open up your understanding of the comparative pairs that you're looking at and give you a way of delving deeper into the ideas so that you have some really fantastic material in which to compare when you're writing your essays for either your SAC or your exam. Today we're looking at the pairing of I am Malala and pride. And so what we're going to cover are what we feel are three things that are going to really help you get the best out of yourself as you're reading through these texts, as you're studying them in class, and then as you're writing your essays in a way to get the most out of yourself. And so the very first thing that we're going to look at is this idea of leadership. And now, of course, leadership is something that is very easily attributed to the characters in these texts, and it's something that we can very easily identify. It's probably one of the first things you thought of as you started to read through the second text when you started to find some links. And so it's really, really important that we don't just leave it at that word. We want to go beyond leadership. We want to go beyond identification of a theme, of an idea, and we want to start asking the right questions about it so that we can really tease out some fantastic thinking. And so what I want you to be thinking about when it comes to leadership is this word in how people come to be leaders, the process that they go through. Because when we start to think this way, we start to be able to come up with evidence that allows us to compare and make really rich comparisons between the texts, not only just about how these people come into a position of leadership, but through that, what these texts might be saying and what their authors and their director might be saying about how people come to be leaders.
Not worried about being too visible this time. Shut up and march.
And so when we look at I am Malala, we need to think about the idea of, are leaders born? Are they just naturally born to be that way? Or are they made? Or is there somewhere that's in between? Of course, having a definite answer to either of those questions isn't really important. It's more so the thinking behind it as we look to explore that idea. And so we know that when the Taliban come for Malala, that she is shot because she's the only girl with her face not covered. And I think that's just an excellent, succinct quote that really shows how Malala stands out. And when we come to think of this a little bit further, we can think because of the leadership of her father as well, who's a leader in his own right, and the way in which he has made her feel her entire life and the values that he has instilled in her led to her being on that day the only girl with her face not covered, that she stood out from the rest, that she was somewhat different to everybody else. And so when we think about that, we can start to look at it in comparison to characters like Mark. And when at the very beginning of Pride, we have that quote that whatever Mark says, we do, don't ask me why. And so Mark instead is rather just this very enigmatic leader. He's someone who very easily can get people to fall in line behind him and to follow their cause. He's fearless in the way that he goes about what he believes in and getting people to join him in his battle against the injustices that he can see. And so we need to be thinking about the comparisons that we can make about not just those two characters, but how they come to be leaders and how much of it is just naturally in their enigmatic personas and how much is it through what they've been taught to believe in and what happens to them along the way. Of course, this also goes further when we can look at characters like Joe and Shan from Pride and the manner in which we see them evolve throughout the film. Early on in the film, we see Joe standing back from the Pride rally, not really sure of who he is and where he fits in and whether he wants to be seen to be showing that side of himself, to then at the end being the person who is in charge of the concert and in helping the miners. This is a person who's gone on an immense journey in the space of 1 year to really find themselves as a leader of a community that they weren't sure they wanted to be a part of only a year before. Of course, we also have that quote from Hafina where she talks about Shan saying, well, she's finding her feet. And it's a really great way of outlining the fact that leadership is sometimes thrust upon people, that leadership is sometimes something that people find themselves walking into, or that it can be something that takes time. And so across all of these things, we need to think about the different ways in which people find themselves in positions of leadership and then how this is used. And we can start to find some really key differences as well when we we start to think about the fact that not all leadership is positive across these two texts, that we have people like Fazula who have these broadcasts that end up espousing hate and ignorance. And we also have the people like Maureen who would have said to her, you know, you're a respected woman, Maureen. People listen to you. And of course, this isn't always for positive benefit for the rest of the society. And so in summing up, when we're thinking about leadership, we need to think about more than just identification of the fact that both of these texts show leaders. We need to look at everything that exists around that, the manner in which people become leaders, the environment in which they can become leaders, and then also what they do with that leadership and the impacts that it has on people around them. Of course, if you want to open it up further, you can start to look at the way in which people will follow leaders. And when we have the people of Pakistan and the ruling of the Taliban and how they were able to come and seize power so quickly, we need to think about how that can come about and the things that people need to fight against in order to become a leader for a positive cause. And so that leads us really nicely into idea number 2 that we want to explore today, and that is the idea of ignorance. And so again, just like with leadership, we want to go beyond identification. We know that ignorance exists in both of these texts, but we need to start to look at the different ways in which it exists and the different impacts that it has on people, because those differences are going to be where we're going to start to find the best source of comparison and the ways that we can be more insightful when we're writing about these texts. So how does ignorance come about? How is it that it exists in either of these texts? We can look at the fact that both parties, LGSM and Malala, and what she ends up standing for, look at themselves in a fight against ignorance, in that ignorance takes on this characteristic, this personality of itself, that it's something that is embodied in people's attitudes, and it's something that they feel they must fight against. On top of that, they're not just fighting against people, they're not fighting against other people, they're actually fighting against an ideal and the way in which people think. And obviously we see that the ignorance can be pervasive, it can impact on every single person involved in these texts. So when we start to look at the impact of it, we can start to look at people like Malala's mother, and it talks about the fact that she is very devout, and it also talks about her lack of education. Malala goes further later on in the text to describe how politicians look to keep people ignorant in order to stay in power. So now we can actually take this idea a bit further to start to think about how ignorance is used by certain people in order to suppress the population, in order to get them to be fearful, in order to get them to follow their ideals. And so people's ignorance can be exploited. On top of that, we can also see the ugly side of ignorance when it comes to the impact that it has on people like Gethin, that this idea that people have about homosexuals in the 1980s in the United Kingdom leads to them being fearful for their safety, where they have a rule where they only leave in twos, they don't go out on their own, and that Gethin is beaten up just merely for the fact of who he is. Such is the power of ignorance that it can lead people to be so hateful and so spiteful and so evil in their outlook that they can look to hurt another just merely for the way in which they live their life. And so if we're going to really open up the idea of ignorance and go further than just pointing out that it exists, we need to look at the antonyms for the word like ignorance. You know, things such as to be enlightened, to have knowledge, to understand, to have compassion, to have empathy. All of these terms are things that we should be looking to use when we're thinking and writing about this idea, because it's what the texts are trying to put forward in their message in terms of how we can be positive and how we can go beyond ignorance. Of course, the manner in which either of these texts aim to get people beyond their ignorant views of the world is again another rich source of comparison that you might want to use when you're looking at writing some practice sacks and so on. And so as we go further than that, we can actually start to look at the media as well. And there's that fantastic quote from Cliff where he talks about, I don't believe what they say about us, so why would I believe what they say about them? And so this introduces this idea that we can have these ignorant views broadcast to a nation, to a large group of people, and that these insidious ideas and this ignorance about the way in which people live and the views that we have about them can be manipulated by the media. And we see this as well obviously in I Am Malala with Fazula and his broadcasts and the manner in which the Taliban look to spread misinformation or keep people ignorant through denying them education. Of course, how this is overcome happens in two very different ways. In I Am Malala, we have these examples where formal education is seen as this antidote to ignorance. If we're going to look at that a little bit differently when it comes to pride, it's not so much formal education in a school setting, it's more so about a level of knowledge and understanding. And the antidote to ignorance in pride, where it differs from I Am Malala, is about finding that shared humanity, about finding that sense of togetherness as people underneath all of the labels that we've placed upon each other. And so in summing all of that up, we need to look at ignorance in a manner where we're looking at the fact that it can exist in all of us. We can see the fact that a blunt understanding of the film Pride is that we had these ignorant miners that eventually take on the support of the gay community in the United Kingdom. However, if we're going to be a bit sharper than that, we can also see that the members of LGSM were also a little bit ignorant about where these miners lived, about how they lived their lives and so on, and that the most beautiful moments of this film are when the two of them are coming together and beginning to understand each other as people from both sides. It's not just a case of one party being ignorant. It's a case of people not always being malevolent in their ignorance, but sometimes lacking some knowledge and needing some further understanding about these things. Of course, when it comes to Malala, we have the other side of that, where we have these highly dangerous situations that come about because of the spread of ignorance. And so in looking to ask further questions, we think about how does ignorance come to exist? Who benefits from it and who looks to keep on keeping people ignorant, how it can be overcome and how that differs, and the manner in which each party has some sort of success in doing that. All of these things are going to be places where you're going to be able to find some great differences. And so with our third idea that's going to really help you understand these texts well, it goes a little bit further than ignorance, and it starts to look at the idea of identity and labels that we place upon each other. And this is a really intriguing idea, I think, because there's two really clear sides to it. The name of the film, Pride, obviously shows that this is about a group of people that are proud of who they are and that they actually have to fight against commonly held attitudes in order to show people that they very much have the right to be proud of who they are. And so with that comes this idea of labels and the labels that are placed upon them. And we see that they have this tradition of taking a slur that's been used against them and owning it.
There is a long and honourable tradition in the gay community, and it has stood us in good stead for a very long time. When somebody calls you a name, am I right about this, Jonathan?
Dead right.
You take it and you own it.
There are many labels that are thrown about in either of the films, and there are ways that people identify themselves. What's very interesting about this idea, though, is that whilst the labels that we use for ourselves and the way in which we identify ourselves can be a source of respect for ourselves and a source of great pride within ourselves, it can also be the labels that people use to keep us down, the labels that people use in order to exploit people and to continue with ignorance and hatred and, these malevolent actions. And so as we begin to look at that, we can start to think of all the different ways that people identify themselves across these texts. Is it through their nationality? Is it through their occupation? Is it through their sex and gender? Is it through their sexual orientation? Is it through their religion? There are all of these different ways that people are seen and the ways that people find great pride in who they are. But the other side to that is that these are the things where people can start to label others and to start to use that as a division between us as a group of human beings. And so where we see this come into action with the idea of ignorance is that these labels can be a great source of pride, but they can also be the start of division as well. And that really true progress only comes about when people begin to understand each other and to see that common humanity. I want to finish with a really fantastic quote, I think, that sums up all of these ideas really well. And it might be something that the first time you watched Pride, you probably just went past and didn't think much of. But think about the scene where Cliff talks about the black seam of coal that runs underneath the earth. And when he discusses that miners from Wales or America or Spain, anybody would look at that seam and know what they were looking at. And it's just a great way of showing that underneath everything, ideally being this coal seam that exists underneath the earth, that people of different nationalities would all have that common link and that they would be able to see it. And so we can take that idea and we can think about what that means about people in this search for humanity and the different ways people have to struggle in this search for humanity with these barriers that are put up there in front of them. So guys, that's 3 ideas that we've had today. Of course, there are millions of more things that we could be saying and we'd like to. Please make sure that if you have any questions about what's been brought up today, or if there's anything that you're not 100% sure of that you'd like clarified, or if you have any questions about the pairings, please put them down below in the comments. Our aim with these videos at the English Lab is to help you out with your studying as you get ready for your exams and for your SACs. So please put any comments that you have below, share any ideas that you might have below. If you've enjoyed the video, please like it and share it with your friends so we can help out as many people as possible. We'll also have some subsequent videos coming up, not just for this pairing, but also for some of the Section A texts, as well as some videos where we look at things like sample paragraphs and sample essays and how to go about responding to questions, as well as some language analysis material that we're really excited about sharing with you as well. The best way to keep up to date with all of those things is to subscribe to the English Lab's YouTube channel. That way you'll receive notifications and everything will be there all in the one place in order to help you out. But until next time, all the best with your studies and thanks very much for joining us.